Hey everyone, welcome to this new video of Next.js where we are going to discuss about the server actions. What are server actions first? So basically, if you want to call a function, on server from a client, how will you call it? So in general, if you are using React or Next.js before app router, how will you do it? How can you call a function at the server from client? You will create an API, and using that API you will trigger that API. That API will hit a function which is a request handler, and where you can perform your server side task and return the response to back to the client, and client will take that response and you can show it on your UI, right? So this is the traditional method of invoking a function on server. But with Next.js 13.4, now we have server actions. What does it mean? So basically you will simply create a function, register it with your client component, and when you click on a button or you submit a form or manually, you can directly call that function. And there is no need to create a separate API to invoke that function. So internally Next.js will trigger HTTP request to the server, and whatever you return from that function, that will be HTTP response for the client. Okay, so internally Next.js will handle it. We don't have to work with any kind of Axios or fetch request. Just call the function, get the result. That's it. To understand this example, I've created an example. I've created a project called server actions project, and here we have a template of Next.js, which when we create a project, it gives you, right? So in the app component, inside app, the layout.tsx, page.tsx, all the JavaScript, TypeScript files are server files, right? Inside the app component. So the layout.js is server component, page.tsx is server component. Okay, so now I am removing everything from the server component, which is the main file of our Next.js project. So let's remove it. So this will be the file which we will get back when we visit to the localhost :3000. Okay, now from the global.cs I will remove everything, just make it simple. And inside main, I will add a function, a function component, any kind of component, basically client component I want to use. So inside the src folder I have components folder, and inside components folder I have a button folder. Inside buttons folder I will create a button.tsx, where I will create simply function component, React function component. Now this is button, right? Let's change it to button and button. Now we will use this button in main server component. Now button component, I'm repeating multiple times component, server component, client component, so that you can know that which is client component, which is server component. So currently we do not have any client component. This button is server component, page.tsx, like home page, is server component. Okay, because we are importing that button.tsx directly inside the server component, so by default this is server component. Okay, so now inside button, if you want to handle click, so on click is equals to handle click. We have a function handle click, const handle click is equals to a function, and then simply write console.log clicked on button and will be on client, right? That's it. Now we can reload the page and we will get an error. What is the error? That we cannot add any kind of props like on click or the React side prop, the client side props in the server components, right? So it means the button is server component. How can you make it client component? Just use a directive use client like this, and now we are ready to use on click. When I click on this button, you can see on the console that we are clicking on the button and it will be on client. There is no console on server. It means this function is invoking on the server. Now how will you call a function on the server side? So if you do not have this server actions, how will you do it? Think about it. You will create an API, you will hit that API using Axios and fetch. That API will trigger the handler, and handler function will run the code which you want to perform on the server side, because handler functions are running on server side. And then the handler function will return some response, and you will get back that response on the client side, and you can use that response to show on UI and just update the UI, right? But now server actions do not have to create the API direct. you directly can call a function on server. How can you call it? Let's create a folder actions inside src, and inside actions I will create a function called sample action, sample action.ts. Inside sample action.ts I will create a function called export function sample action. This sample action will accept a message of type string. I will pass a function. I want to pass some values when I invoke this function, and it should be async function. So export async function like this, and let's add the console.log with the message. And now we want to we want to use this function sample action function on server. So we will use server, that this file will be used on server. So we are telling Next.js that this file will be used on server. Okay, now import this function in client component. Here we can call this function inside client component. So import sample action like this and call this with some kind of message for server. Now you cannot call this function directly because error we have, this experimental server actions option is enabled on your config. So we need to add this configuration because now the server actions are in experimental mode for now. Okay, so maybe when you are watching this video, this is in stable and this is not in experimental mode. So for now I need to add this in next config, that I want to use some experimental features and I want to use server actions should be true. Okay, now we are aware about that it's in experimental mode and some kind of error we get, we will be responsible for that. Okay, so now we are ready to use the server component. Okay, so I'm reloading the page, I'm clicking on this button, and you can see the message for server, right? Message for server. This function we are calling this function, basically this function is in running on server. So when I click on this button, you can see in client component you are getting clicked on button and will be on client, but for the next function call, this is a server component. This is the server function and this is server action, and we are calling this in client component, but we are getting this message for server in server component. You can see the server console, right? So here I'm passing a message and logging this on the console. So this is how you can use server actions. So earlier I talked about the HTTP request. You can check the network request. When I click on this button, we will see that there will be a request to that server action. Let me zoom out. See, localhost. Okay, let me reload the page, clear the console, clear the network tab, and click on button. So when I click on button, Next.js is internally calling HTTP request with the payload message for server. Whatever we passed message to this server action function, that will be payload of that request, and in the response we are getting undefined, that we are not returning anything from that server action, right? So from the server action I can return something. Let's return something. We can only return a plain JavaScript object. So return message that success, and then that's it, message success. Now let's go to the button, and now again click on this button. When I click on this request, you can see in the payload we are passing message for server, and preview response we are getting the message. So how simple is this, that we can directly call this function inside client component and get the result in the client component directly, whatever you return from the function. How can you get this message, whatever we are returning from here? So let's make this function async, and await for the result. We will await, and then const we will get the response back from the function, whatever we get. Now console.log response. I'm printing that response. Now see, when I click on this button, something went wrong. Reload the page. Okay, now I've created a async function. So basically this should be function. This would be a function created using function keyword. So basically I followed the documentation also, everyone like creating function component. So at this moment, like I'm not clear why this error is there, but documentation like the documentation is in the same form, that we are using we are not using arrow functions anywhere. let's use function for all the server actions. Okay, that's why I'm using function keyword here. So do not use arrow function for now, just use function with a function keyword. Okay, now I will click on this and you can see we are getting message back to the client. Okay, the function is getting invoked on the server, we are getting that response on the client. Just using this await and call this function, await the response, await the function, and then we will get back the response. How amazing this is. So now if you want to show some kind of loading state that a server is busy in doing something, at that time you can show some kind of loader. How? We have a function, we have a hook use transition. We have a hook use transition. We can call this hook, and this hook will return two values, that the server action is pending and start transition. So basically whenever you call this function, you can start the transition. Okay, let's call this function from start transition. So basically you will call that start transition function, we will pass a arrow function like this, and from the arrow function you will invoke this function. Okay, now when you invoke this function, the pending property will be pending, and when your server action will be performed and will get the response, this pending will be false. Okay, so now let's create it. Let's add it to the UI div, and then is pending, and then h1 loading. Okay, now let's click on button. Now you can see loading. Okay, so let's add a server component. In server component I'm adding a timeout function so that it will take some time. Okay, so I'm returning a promise, return new promise, return new promise, and get the resolve here. But this resolve function will be called after 2 seconds, right? So basically I'm simulating 2 seconds of interval, that this function will take 2 seconds to resolve, right? So now from the set timeout I want to return this function, right, and these values. So I will resolve these values from here, resolve the value, and now this is the promise. I can await it, const response await it. We have created a promise object. Now we are awaiting it. It will take 2 seconds to resolve. After getting response, I will return this response. So let's print this response first and then return it from the function. So whatever I return from the function, that will be the response of client. So let's go to the button component. We are starting the transaction. Loading will be for 2 seconds, and then we will get the response back. Let's see. Click on the button. Now we are loading 1, 2, and then finish. Let's print the response. How can I get that response? From the response I can await the transition. Let's go to the documentation. Let me check it. How will it just start the transition? There is no example of awaiting the response. So let's try it. I will await the start transition is returning nothing. This is void, and I can write await here and simply get the response const response at the client side. Now I'm using await so that I can use async here, async. Now I'm getting response console.log response. Now when I click on this button, you can see that it is taking 2 seconds, and now I'm getting the message. So I want to show this message or success, whatever we are getting in the client component. For this I will use state, const state, so that I can call its response, and then set response is equals to use state. This is client component. We can use states here, right? Create an empty object, and then from the button I can add the pre tag so that it will parse, it will structure the JSON, stringify the response with replacer null and for tab. Now there is nothing. Click on button, loading, and then we will get the data. Oh, there is no data because I am not setting the state. So after getting the response, I will set the state, set response with this response object. Perfect. What happened? A response unknown is not assignable to the type of something, right? So let's make it of type any. For now, you do not have to use any, right? Avoid any. Now click on this button, loading, and after getting response, we'll set the state, and state is in front of us. So this is how server actions works. It is really simple. You do not have to call any kind of API. Just call the server action directly inside the function and you are ready to go. So where you can add it. So if you are using an e-commerce application, you have a add to cart button. On add to cart button, you do not have to call the API. Just click on the button add to cart, and that server action will call add to cart function or DB or anything that will return the response whether it was successful or not. The second reason to use the server action, that in the form. So if you are using a form and inside the form submission, you want to submit that form data to the server. So without any API call, you can directly call that server function with form data. You can directly upload any image without any HTTP request manually, right? There is an HTTP request, but there is no need to set up it manually. Next.js will do it for you internally. So in the next video, we will talk about talk about the form data and how you can submit forms in Next.js with server actions. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe the channel for more Next.js content. That's it. Thank you.